so I just want to thank you all for joining us today. Our primary topic is how to help compliance teams be able to support cloud migrations at scale. So how does your program scale with compliance? My name is Christine Harper. I am a PCI DSS QSA with AWS Security Assurance Services. I have about 15 years experience in security, compliance, and IT. And I'm joined by Avik Mukherjee, who's with AWS. He is a senior security consultant and a previous or former QSA for P2PE and DSS. And then I've got Jonathan Glass, who is the Director of Cloud Security at Global Payments. Before we get into the presentation, I do want to state that although AWS Security Assurance Services is a QSAC, we are a QSA company, we do not assess AWS, and we don't assess our customers and write their rocks. We actually are consultants to help them migrate to the cloud and implement compliance, and then they are assessed by their own QSAs. So with that in mind, we're going to start off with Avik. He is going to do the unique cloud characteristics, and then Jonathan and I are going to tag team internal shared compliance responsibility, cloud migration strategy, the benefits of having a cloud security baseline model, and how you can transform your PCI DSS program. Avik?
Okay, thank you, Christine. Yep, to support a PCI assessment of cloud workloads, it is very important for the stakeholders who are managing the compliance program to understand some unique characteristics of cloud. So let's take a look at the few. So cloud by design is elastic and dynamic in nature. That leads to a very dynamic asset inventory. So it is important for us to adopt tagging and data classification so that you can, at a given point, correctly identify your scope. Additionally, cloud abstracted services provides additional layer of isolation in terms of data and application layer, in addition to the physical layers that we have been dealing with. So this gives us an ability to manage those workloads in an efficient way in addition to the segmentation controls. Cloud also provides greater developer agility. It gives developers power so that they can provision their environment without having to wait for pre-provisioned infrastructure. Now, this greater ability requires that the central security and compliance team have a good amount of governance over this team so that they do not negatively impact the security and, in turn, the compliance program. So you have cloud-wide controls that gives you ability to detect and potentially prevent negative changes that tamper with security controls that helps you implement your PCI DSS compliance. With cloud, DevSecOps is a very important operating model on cloud that gives you the power to innovate while ensuring that security is embedded in infrastructure as code. So your internal audit and compliance team needs to be trained on this operating model so that they can understand and speak the language that is spoken by your cloud developers and builders. This leads to a good, efficient compliance program that embraces assessment of cloud workloads. Last but not least, you may have heard this, that the shared responsibility model. Now, this is a very important consideration when you are dealing with cloud workloads. So you have to understand that your cloud service provider, or CSP, is another vendor in your compliance program. This requires that you study their PCI DSS AOC and responsibility matrix so that you understand the controls that they manage versus what you are responsible for.
All right, so continuing with that shared responsibility model that Avik was just talking about, when you're using a cloud service providers are responsible for security and compliance of the cloud, while customers are responsible for security and compliance in the cloud. So what that means is your cloud service provider is going to protect and maintain the infrastructure that powers the cloud services that you decide to use, while your responsibility is going to be determined based upon the type of service that you leverage. So if you use a more abstracted service that the cloud provider maintains, you will have less responsibility as the customer to maintain the compliance of the components of that service. One of the rules of thumb we like to use that if a configurable option is presented to you as the customer, that means you are responsible for its configuration and for its compliance. So if you can change it, you are responsible for it. Another misconception that we do see often is that if the cloud service provider is PCI compliant and the services they provide are PCI compliant, that automatically translates to PCI compliance for the customer. That is not the case. Actually, every customer is responsible for obtaining and maintaining their own PCI DSS compliance in addition to leveraging their cloud service provider's AOC. All right, so let's take shared responsibility internally. This is not a cloud-only concept. This is actually something you probably do internally already, you just don't look at it this way. So you've got network teams, you've got database admins, you've got system admins. All of these teams manage certain sets of security components within your environment and share the responsibility internally of maintaining security within your environment now. So as you move to the cloud, you want to make sure that you understand who's responsible for what and what is your service provider going to do for you. As you use each service is different. So which controls are you now shifting to your cloud service provider to be responsible for, and which controls are you still maintaining internally? Taking that a step further, which controls are you providing to your internal teams that are deploying workloads in there as a baseline set of security controls? Which controls are you always deploying within your environment that all of your workloads are going to consume? They don't have a choice. Those are configured for them. They don't get to change those. And then what are your workload and your app teams responsible for when they do deploy within your environment? What controls are specific to their workload that now belong to that workload team or to another team that's not part of that baseline architecture? So being able to have the responsibility defined internally lets you tell your internal teams, here's what we're doing, here's what you're responsible for, and here's what we're going to do for you when you deploy your workloads to the cloud. So I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan, who's going to get into more technical details regarding that.
Hey guys, between you and lunch, I'll go fast. So key items on the screen here are security controls and guardrails, and then self-service cloud vending. So as my team up here has pointed out, we as compliance and we as security have a part to play. We have to step in at the beginning. We have to go through all of our corporate controls, all of our regulatory controls, and make sure we have a list of security controls that we can hand off and give to the development teams, in our case, DevSecOps teams. And those controls get tied into what we call guardrails. So Christine just said that the guardrails are the universally applied tools and controls and security that happen everywhere. And those get baked into that cloud vending machine. The net effect is when we spin up a new service or a new effort, they automatically inherit all of that. The cool part is, because you're assessing and reviewing things that are consistently deployed, when you review this with your app teams about the new application they're deploying, your level of assessment is much smaller, and so you can focus in on the business value they're driving and how to secure that properly. Excuse me. This all drives into what we call the baseline security controls. This is part of our effort as well. So overall, you get repeatable deployments, repeatable architecture. You end up with centralized cloud security management as well as compliance management. And you end up with your compliance and security policies as code. So this is a really cool feature. Everything in the cloud is driven by APIs. And so you're able to assess these things, write your rules, write your checks, to make sure they comply with your compliance requirements as well as your security requirements. And you'll notice the third bullet underneath that, compliance and security policies, is evidence collection mechanisms. So let's talk about that, because that's part of our flywheel design. I do have a joke here, a bad dad joke. I've heard several here so far. Hey Christine, what do you call a fly with no wings?
I think everybody knows it's on the board there.
It's a walk. Okay, fine. I commissioned custom artwork for this joke, and my daughter kindly generated a really fly bicycle for us. So, and that's all the bad jokes today. Okay. So as a security team and as a compliance team, you want to be reviewing, as she said, new services as they come out. You're going to find the developers are going to say, hey, here's this cool new widget from Amazon that came out, or a cool new widget from GCP. And you as a security team and you as a compliance team need to dig into that, understand what's going on, and how to configure it, how to secure it, how to be compliant, and understand the use case for it. And so in the flywheel diagram here, those are you defining your requirements. Those requirements you drive into security controls, and those security controls go out into what we call proactive controls. So these are tools like policy as code that check developers' code before they commit it, so that there's no chance that they can introduce weaknesses or misconfigurations. Then inside the cloud environment, you have reactive controls. And these monitor the config of your environment in real time, and in case something does go wonky, it alerts you that something is out of whack and you can take advantage or remediate it. And then we have what on here is we call rapid response or auto remediation, and that is a control that is watching that config. We know it's something we don't ever want to have happen, and within milliseconds to seconds of that bad thing happening, it automatically puts it back to a known state and alerts and makes sure that things are in place. And so you end up with this continuous cycle of finding new threats, finding new services, and adding in, when you find the new control, you make sure you add it into each of those sectors so that you are always consistent across the board. And the cool part is, the last section on there is evidence collection. So you take that same set of controls and you do it into an evidence collection mantra. So our service that we've created internally, my guys worked really hard on this for several months. And so this now runs in our environment and collects all of our technical PCI controls that we have to assess and stores them. I'll show you an architecture in a second. So the cool part of this is, as new services are built, they're automatically included. And as you go through your assessments and you pick up new things you have to ask questions, or new questions you have to answer, you add that back to your flywheel, add that back to your automated evidence collection. And so by the time the next iteration comes around your next year, you've addressed those questions in advance, and it makes for a much more consistent, much more, I like to say, much more consistent and less fatigue. It creates less fatigue on the team, sorry. And then a big key thing for us, if you'll notice the 4th bullet down here, is minimizing human interaction with environments. So the first drawing was those concentric circles. Infrastructure as code was the outermost one. You want to make sure that anything happening in those environments that you are building with your landing zones and frameworks are totally done through automation, no human interaction. And then you also make sure you have your config checks and your reactive controls in place. In case someone does something stupid, you can still go back and react and put it back the way it was, and then go talk to those people. So anyway, here's the quick diagram of what we've done for global payments. So you see we started with our PCI requirements, PCI DSS requirements. This is a massive, massive spreadsheet, as I'm sure everybody can imagine. And all of our corporate requirements are in there too. And then we turned that into automatic collection mechanisms. And these guys run all the time and store the evidence for us in a database. And then off that, we're able to monitor these controls. We can see if the jobs are running or failing, et cetera. And then finally, when it is time for assessments, we're able to hand over, in percentage of our control data, our evidence to the auditor. And then we can spend time walking through the rest through a normal interview process. So Christine, back to you.
All right, so how do you take the concepts that Jonathan just explained and apply those to your PCI program? So that's, the technical compliance, you've got those configurations in place, but how do I leverage them from a program perspective and make my program more efficient? One of the things that the evidence collection framework does is it makes evidence self-service to your audit teams. So now your audit teams can go in and collect that evidence without interacting with the teams and taking them away from their regular jobs. So they have the ability to get that, but that doesn't transform your program. That's just making it a little more efficient. You actually have to include those teams. You need to include your compliance teams in your project migration efforts. They need to understand what's going on, and they also need to be educated. So they need to be included in your cloud education initiatives. And like Avik said, they have to be able to talk the same language. They've got to be able to communicate with your internal teams and tell them exactly what they need, because it's not the same terminology that the teams are used to when they're asking for information or doing interviews. So making sure that those teams are involved prepares them for not only conducting the assessment, but creating more efficiencies to their own internal program and leveraging some of the automation that's being built in to support faster, more efficient assessments with their QSA. And as those efficiencies are created with the automation and more is created with the cloud infrastructure, you want to make sure that that's going into the maturity of your compliance program. And so this is a basis for supporting cloud migrations at scale. If you can say, I've made all of these efficiencies based on this automation so that we can make sure compliance continues and we don't have to take so much time away from people, they can continue doing their job and innovating and deploying as they need to. So in this case, we want to take it one step further. I want to take the continuous compliance and I want to combine it with that shared responsibility that we talked about earlier, those two tables of who's responsible for what. So this is a ROC reference model. This is more or less taking like your service providers and you reference their ROCs when you leverage their services, and those are referenced within your own ROC because they're responsible for those controls. So imagine that I'm a company and I have multiple workloads that are going to be deployed over the next 12 months. But my assessment of the cloud baseline architecture and what was assessed already was done 3 months ago. I need these workloads to be PCI compliant before the next annual assessment, which means those guys have to be assessed again. Well, we don't want to do that. So instead of continuously reassessing those teams, look at them as an internal service provider. How do I make my cloud baseline set of controls that are always deployed consistently over and over again with every workload that I have? How can I make that a ROC reference? So I now have the ability to say, all right, these controls are managed by my cloud service provider. These controls are managed by the cloud baseline architecture that we own internally. And I'm the workload. I don't manage it. I can't change it. So I'm going to consume that. And I can have an assessment in the middle of the year and be able to have a ROC whose scope is this big because all of my controls that I can't touch and change and manage are referenced as a ROC in my own ROC. Or you have other companies within your company and you have to have multiple ROCs for business reasons. So this gives you the flexibility as a program to minimize continuous assessments of these teams over again and reduces the fatigue on those teams.
Okay, so we covered a lot, but just to summarize before your lunch break, the key takeaways that you can take. One is adequate preparation for your PCI compliance program and alignment within your internal teams helps align with the business initiative to move to cloud fast while ensuring that you are not negatively impacting the PCI compliance program. Secondly, as Christine said, by leveraging a secure and a baseline architecture, even large enterprise can scale their security controls on cloud. And the efficiencies they gain by this, they can use it to improve their PCI strategies for long term. And thirdly, the most important thing is by implementing the shared responsibility model, not just in the cloud, but internally within your team, and taking a layered approach to your PCI compliance program helps reduce the audit fatigue that comes in. It also ensures that you reduce the potential impact whereby there are resource constraints. So resources are always in constraint mode, and you need to make use of whatever you have in hand. And other things like, again, educate your PCI team or any other compliance and audit team in the language that cloud is or the builders are speaking so that they can translate what they require and the builders can build to support the PCI compliance program. So that being said, thanks for taking time out before lunch, listening to us. If you need more information, you can always connect with us, and we'll be in the hallways for a chit chat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.